I have an interesting relationship with the Netflix original animated television show Kipo and the Age of Wonderbeasts. Seeing the trailers of season 1 for the first time got me super excited to watch it, but when it came out, it ended up gathering dust in my plan to watch list for months on end. I did eventually get around to watching it, and it didn't quite meet my expectations. I did like it, but I knew it had the potential to be so much more. I made a video on the topic wherein I called the show an underdeveloped masterpiece, and I figured I would get a lot of flack for criticizing a show that had been almost universally praised everywhere else on the internet, but that didn't happen. Quite the opposite, in fact. A lot of people actually really resonated with my opinion about the show. Everyone recognized the quality that was present in Kipo, but everyone knew it had so much more potential, and everyone, including myself, was very excited to see if season 2 would improve on what we already had. So fast forward several months to the present day, and season 2 is out, which only begs the question, is Kipo and the Age of Wonderbeasts no longer an underdeveloped masterpiece? Can the second season of this show drop the underdeveloped and now simply be called a masterpiece? Well, let's find out. Also, huge spoilers for season 2 ahead if that wasn't already obvious.
And we're gonna do it together.
Let's start off with the easy stuff, which just so happens to be the same stuff I started out with last time, the visuals. I really enjoy this show's art direction in general, but I did criticize season 1 for its animation. See my other video for elaboration. So did season 2 improve? Well, I'd say yeah, it did. I, for one, didn't notice very much fake animation, so to speak. Stuff like scaling an image up and down and repositioning it on the screen, you get the idea. This kind of thing was actually not that uncommon in season 1, but I think that this show has definitely improved in this regard. To be fair, I also didn't notice any standout moments of Sakuga which were also present in season 1, but I think that this trade-off was worth it. It's not the kind of improvement that you can point to one specific moment and go, there, that's what's better. It just feels like the characters generally have a little bit more fluidity to their movement. And this isn't to say that the visuals are amazing or anything. The characters are still a little choppy, the action scenes are a little lacking in the realm of momentum and weight, but overall, I still very much enjoyed looking at my screen while watching this season, and I think it was an improvement over season 1. And a similar thing can be said for the audio. My biggest gripe with season 1 sonically was that the music it chose to use was often ill-fitting of the scene it was being played over, despite the songs themselves being pretty good. However, I am happy to proclaim that this issue I found in the show is largely solved in season 2, and there really isn't much to elaborate on here. I just think the background music works better with the visuals more often, and all the music tracks are still great on their own. Again, it's not incredible, but a noticeable improvement in my eyes. Anyways, now that we've covered the easy stuff, let's get into the more substantial elements of this season and the stuff that sets it most apart from season 1. Our main character, Kipo Oak, has a lot more going on this time around, or at least it feels that way. See, in season 1, Kipo's main emotional conflict came from learning that she's part mute. Now, I did think that this was handled very well, and it served as a satisfying point of character growth. However, it was pretty incidental to the main plot, which was tracking down the backup burrow and Kipo's dad. However, now that we have a main goal which requires conflict and confrontation, getting Kipo's dad back from Skaar Lamine, the development of Kipo's powers becomes a lot more important. And the show is aware of this because it has the group find some goats who are for some reason incredibly spiritually knowledgeable or something, and they're blind, and they're obsessed with cheese that they definitely use their own milk to create. Seriously, what the fuck is up with these goats? Anyway, they do the whole teaching the young pupil by making them do a seemingly meaningless task that actually turns out to be very applicable to the skill that they are trying to learn. Pretty tropey and predictable, but whatever. They show Kipo how to use her jaguar powers, but warn her that if she isn't careful while using them, she could lose sight of her human self and start
Going savage.
Now, this is great. It effectively puts a limiter on Kipo's capabilities while still advancing her narrative, and it gives her a roadblock to get around for the midsection of the season before we have our big confrontation with Skaar Lamine. I will say that one thing I was a little disappointed about was that this doesn't really relate to Kipo's past struggles regarding her powers. She was worried that people would think of her differently once they found out that she was half mute, and while she did move past her hangups about this, teaching the audience that you aren't defined by one singular trait, I was really hoping that we'd get to see Kipo Kipo encounter someone who berated her for being half mute or something and see her brush it off, solidifying her character growth. Because as sad as it is, there are people who will treat you differently based on your physical appearance or any other singular trait you might have. And while I appreciate the message that they would have liked you better if they knew more about you, which Kipo and Wolf's resolution in Season 1 evoked, I also really value the don't care about what other people think of you lesson. This isn't really a flaw with this season, just a missed opportunity in my opinion. So the goats tell Kipo and friends that Kipo needs an anchor to remind her of her human self, otherwise she could end up hurting her friends, which does obviously happen later on.
Come back to us.
While in full Jaguar mode, Kipo dislocates Benson's shoulder. In response to this, Kipo makes the decision to never go full Jaguar again to make sure she doesn't hurt anyone she cares about. But later in the episode, she learns that she can control her powers and use them for good. Now, I'm not gonna act like I'm a genius for realizing this, but Kipo's struggle with her powers is literally Aang with firebending. Both Kipo and Aang develop a new power, accidentally hurt one of their friends with it, swear to never use it again out of guilt, forgive themselves later on, and use it to resolve the main conflict. However, there are a few key differences in the two of their arcs that makes Kipo's noticeably less impactful. The first of which being that Aang burned Katara because he was being reckless, while Kipo was seemingly running on pure instinct as a knee-jerk reaction to seeing her mom seemingly being taken away by Skaar Lamine. And on top of this, she likely would have been able to transform back into her human form if she hadn't been provoked by a third party. All of this is to say that it was not Kipo's fault that she hurt Benson, and so when she successfully transforms back into a human at the end of the episode, it doesn't really feel like she herself grew, just that the circumstances surrounding her were more appropriate. And of course, the biggest difference between Kipo and Aang in this regard is that Aang took more than a full season to complete this development, and it happens to Kipo in one episode. This results in Kipo's mini arc feeling much less emotionally powerful than it could, and it isn't helped by the fact that Kipo's anchor, the thing that prevents her from going savage, is a picture of her when she was a baby, her mother, and her father. Now, of course, I know that the real anchor the whole time was all of Kipo's friends, but the show really leans into her connection specifically with her mother, and honestly, I don't think it works all that well. Kipo's anchor is supposed to be something that reminds her of her humanity, something that she has a deep emotional attachment to. But first of all, Kipo literally has never met her mom, and more importantly, the connection that Kipo feels towards her mom despite having never met her is clearly tied to her mute half, not her human half. In that dream episode from Season 1, Kipo dreams that her mom returns to their burrow and that she is also half mute who helps Kipo accept her own mute half, plus, you know, her mom literally is also a mute. And this all results in the times when the picture was Kipo's anchor to feel a little unearned for me. Now, you can absolutely make the argument that even if this is the case, it all makes sense once the true anchor is revealed, but well, that leads me into my next point, which is the reveal of the true anchor. I want to make it clear that I have no problems with the fact that Kipo's friends are actually what ties her to her humanity. In fact, I really love that revelation. I think that developing human connections is one of the most important things to be a healthy individual, and so I am 100% for this message. On a narrative storytelling level, however, I do not love how this story beat was delivered. You see, before we came to the revelation that Kipo's friends are the real anchor, we were shown and told on multiple occasions that the picture was Kipo's anchor. The goat said that she would need to find something tangible. Kipo says that she gets an anchory feeling from the picture. Notably, she does not say this about any of her friends, and she looks directly at it when she turns back into her human form. So when we learn that the real anchor was Kipo's friends without any real build-up, it feels like the show is changing its own rules to do whatever suits the dramatic climax best. I mean, technically those indicators that the picture was the anchor do also apply to Kipo's relationship with her friends. Her friends are tangible things, I suppose. Benson is the one holding up the picture, so I guess we can assume that Kipo was actually focusing on him despite what the visual directing would lead us to believe. And I guess we can assume that Kipo just doesn't know what an anchory feeling is supposed to feel like, which is why she didn't realize that her friends are the real anchor. But at least to me, this potential implication did not come across, and so it felt like this revelation came out of nowhere. And in all honesty, I probably wouldn't be that bothered by this if it weren't for the fact that they do the whole pointing out that stuff doesn't make sense as a way to get the audience to stop thinking about it.
Wait, am I the only one who's confused? What was that anchor stuff all about? We spent a lot of time on that.
We're the anchor, Dave. We're the anchor.
Aw, I like that. That's cute.
It's okay, guys, they acknowledge that the audience's time was wasted looking for an anchor, so it's absolved of all criticism. And they do the same thing just moments earlier with Kipo developing a new jaguar form out of nowhere. Kipo goes into jaguar form to push down a tree that's spewing molten gold, and even with the help of her mom, they just can't quite get it.
Oh, and let me just check my periodic table right here. Yeah, okay, so let's take a close look here. Yeah, so we got a melting point of gold right about 1337 degrees. So what's that in Fahrenheit? Okay, well, let's see. We got about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's pretty impressive. Yikes.
But suddenly, Kipo evolves, and with her newfound strength, she and her mom manage to push down the tree, saving everyone. And this is what I take issue with. There is absolutely no way that we could have seen Kipo's transformation coming. It obviously only exists because the plot demands it. Instead of playing off of what we know about this world and Kipo's powers to allow the audience to play along with the action on screen, it's just friendship made Kipo stronger. You can check out this video by Best Guy Ever, which applies this criticism to the shonen manga series Fairy Tail in more depth. It's sorta like if you were playing Breath of the Wild and you spent like dozens of hours digging through all the content, getting new weapons, upgrading your gear, and then you get to the final boss and the game is just like, hey, here's this new weapon that basically lets you auto-win the game. And you're just like, wait, what was all that side questing and adventuring for if you were just gonna give this to me? Obviously, there is nothing inherently wrong with the power of friendship message. It works incredibly well sometimes. I've just seen it done before so many times, and I've seen so many more creative ways to resolve conflict that I felt were much more impactful. And that's really my criticism of Kipo Season 2 here. This wasn't terrible, it just kind of felt like a subpar way to resolve a conflict that I was super invested in, but I'll get into why later. Shifting gears a bit, in my last video I criticized the fact that Kipo would just rush into a potentially dangerous situation despite being told by Wolf how hostile the surface world is. And I lamented the fact that Kipo never gets meaningfully challenged on her obviously over-optimistic perspective. This unfortunately extends into Season 2, or at least the early part of it. Again, I'll elaborate later, as Kipo, after reuniting with her father once again, gives away their presents and tries to take on a group of Skaar Lamine's hench monkeys. This plan obviously doesn't work out and she has to be saved by fucking Dave of all people. So of course I was frustrated here, but this scene does have one critical difference when compared to similar instances from Season 1, which is that Kipo actually has to deal with the long-term consequences of her actions. Because she charged into conflict for no good reason, her father gets taken away and getting him back becomes the central goal of the season. And I thought that this is exactly what was gonna happen and I was super excited to see it happen, but then it kinda just didn't. Kipo meets up with the rest of the main group and tells them what happened. She talks about how ashamed she is that she made the wrong decision, and then Benson, Wolf, and Dave comfort her by saying that she actually doesn't have poor judgment skills and she shouldn't feel ashamed.
I just charged in there with my stupid paw. My dad wants me to become a Mega Jaguar and save everyone. How can I do that when it seems like every instinct I have is wrong?
That's not true. You were right about the Timber Cats. It took in Troy, Dahlia, and Asher, no questions asked.
Your friends are safe because you made the right call there.
And freeing the Mega Monkey? You didn't have to do that, but you did.
The problem is that, yeah, she should feel ashamed. Although Kipo has made some good decisions, she has also made a lot of bad ones, and the show simply ignores this very real character flaw in her and seems to think that she's a perfect person. And I think this can be attributed to people viewing these characters in a very binary manner. Either you're a good person or you're a bad person. There is no in between, and since we can't have people thinking that the main character is a bad person, we have to wipe away any guilt she might feel for the mistakes she's made. See, I don't think Kipo is a bad person. I actually really like her personality, and even when she makes mistakes, I understand that they are always done with the best of intentions. Obviously, Kipo is overall a good person, but so am I. So are you. So are most people on the planet, but we've all still made mistakes that we can and should acknowledge and learn from, because that's how you become a better person. And you know what? As Season 2 continues, Kipo does in fact seem to think a little bit more about her actions and not rush into conflict the way she was prone to doing in Season 1. And I really like this about her arc. It's a lot more passive and subtle. It's not a one episode and the problem's fixed kind of deal. But the fact that this evolution of her character gets kicked off in such an upsetting manner just left a bitter taste in my mouth. Look, I know I've had almost entirely negative things to say about Kipo this season, but I don't want anybody to think that I dislike her. The truth is, I actually thought she was notably more compelling this season. It's just that there are a few instances in her otherwise great story that stick out like sore thumbs, and as such, it's a lot easier for me to explain why they aren't as emotionally compelling than for me to explain why the rest of the story is. Despite my criticisms of the whole picture anchor thing, I actually still found Kipo's relationship with her mom very compelling. Learning about her family's past through flashbacks shown only to the audience works much better now than the flashbacks in season 1 because their purpose isn't to endear us to a character based on their past, though they do accomplish this, but rather to give us important information that directly affects the season's main conflict. And on top of all of this, Kipo's baseline likable traits are still present, making her enjoyable to have interact with the other characters and setting for the most part. So no, I don't dislike Kipo. Moving on, in my last video about this show, I mentioned that I was curious about how Benson's crush on Troy would be developed, and after watching season 2, I can safely say that it was done kinda perfectly. I think. Let me explain. Kipo and the Age of Wonderbeasts is a show that stays relatively focused on its main goal at all times. Yes, the series leans more towards the episodic end of the spectrum, but each individual episode and even each individual scene is usually in service of working towards that end goal. And this is why I'm so happy that Benson and Troy's relationship has nothing to do with any of that. For a long time, I've made the argument that queer characters' sexuality or gender identity or whatever shouldn't always be a core part of their character arc. Keep in mind that I'm saying not always rather than never. I think that there is a lot of value to be found in simply including a minority character in a piece of media and not calling attention to the fact that they are a minority. And Benson is simply the perfect example of this, and on top of being what I think is pretty great minority rep, the fact that his relationship with Troy isn't connected to the main conflict has yet another positive influence on the narrative. That being that it provides breathing room for the rest of the story. I just mentioned that Kipo's episodes are pretty much always focused on something that will get the characters closer to their end goal, and while I really like this storytelling style, it's nice to just have a break sometimes, even if only for a couple of minutes at a time. And that is exactly what Trenson accomplishes. It's just a little side story that reminds the audience that stuff goes on in this world that isn't all about Skaar Lamine and the animosity between mutes and humans. I mean, if we weren't limited to 10 episodes every 6 months, these two would be the perfect duo to have their own little filler episode about. I mean, as it is, we really don't have the time to take such a huge departure from the main story, but even with what we have, I think that at least a little more screen time could be sacrificed to give us some more scenes with these two. And the fact that they would be focusing on a gay black kid and his boyfriend would just be icing on the cake, though I do feel obligated to mention that, unfortunately, not everyone sees it this way. There are some people in the comment sections of my own videos who have expressed the opinion that making so-and-so character gay felt unnecessary and ruined the experience of the show. And in all honesty, I used to think that these people didn't really exist. In my first video about Kipo, I almost didn't include that whole section about Benson being gay, and even during editing, I almost didn't include this little text block here because I figured that everything I was saying about the fact that there shouldn't be anything special or different about the existence of a minority character in media was common knowledge. And after I made that video, I told myself, this is it. You will not make a big deal about the simple existence of a minority character in the shows you talk about anymore. However, in light of recent events, I feel it is necessary to make a comment about this. Minority characters in media are important. Minority characters in media are good. Obviously, there are some minority characters who could be considered problematic, but you get what I mean. And minority characters in media are necessary. And do you want to know why? Because all of these things apply to real minorities in real life. And it is absolutely a good thing that Kipo in the Age of Wonderbeasts is so heavily representing them. Anyways, let's move on to something a little less heavy. Dave is mildly more tolerable this season. I mean, he is still infuriatingly egotistical and still creates problems for the main group, but not as much as in season 1. And hey, he's actually unironically helpful in a couple scenes, so that's an improvement. Okay, let's move on to the actual positives I have with season 2. Firstly, I am happy to say that one of the gripes I had with season 1, which was the dissonance between what was being told and what was being shown about the surface world, is pretty much no longer an issue. Part of this may be due to the simple fact that as we see more and more of the surface world and from more and more perspectives, we, as the audience, continue to build a more definitive understanding of what the world is like, which helps gives the story a stronger sense of place. And if you ask me, by far the best example of this was in episode 4, which centers around Kipo and Wolf traveling into Deathstalker territory. Not only does the setting of an overrun town that is seemingly merged with the skeleton of some gigantic beast immediately evoke a sense of dread. By the way, the background art is still fantastic. Everything I said in the last video about it still applies here, and this is easily one of the best episodes to showcase it. But we also get to actually witness the incredibly dangerous creatures living on the surface that Wolf is always talking about, and on top of doing wonders for the world building, this also makes Wolf's already established character much more emotionally powerful. We see how she had to struggle to survive ever since she was a kid. We see her old home, we see the kitty toys that she used in creative ways to survive, and more importantly, Kipo sees it.
You had a teddy bear.
That's a headrest.
Oh, I can just imagine little Wolf over here all like, these aren't toys, they're survival tools.
I've never said that, but that is true.
A big criticism I had of season 1 was that although we as the viewer learn a lot about Kipo and Wolf, the other characters did not, and so their bond didn't feel nearly as meaningful as it could have. But this is exactly what Kipo and Wolf's relationship needed. Kipo is learning along with the audience about how Wolf used to live and how dangerous her life was before the two of them met. It effectively deepens their bond as friends, and now that I've seen what the creators of this show can manage, I am all the more desperate to get anything like this for Benson. We get like one flashback scene of Benson sneaking into some mute bat's cave to steal back his cassette player from them, but this scene isn't even in service of showing us what Benson and Dave's life was like before the events of the show. It is simply to set up these bats as characters who will come into play in a later episode. We still don't know where Benson lived and how he survived on the surface world before meeting Kipo. We don't know why he's so much more into music than everyone else. We don't know how he met Dave. All of these things would be great topics to explore in order to flesh out Benson's personality, which is already extremely likable, and of course having the other characters learn about this stuff along with the audience would be wonderful, just like it was with Wolf. This is obviously still missed opportunity, but the longer we go on deepening Kipo and Wolf's relationship and not Benson's with anyone, the more I start to feel like he may be slowly turning into a side character. Hopefully that won't happen. Now, I've been discussing the characters of this show for quite some time, and I've stuck to talking about the protagonist partly because I can more easily transition between them since their arcs tend to have a lot to do with one another, but also because, as fate would have it, each of the antagonists in this season have one big thing in common. They are fucking awesome! Let's start with Jamak, since he gets the least screen time this season. For some reason, Jamak's entire existence just kinda flew over my head while watching this show for the first time, so I never really discussed him in my analysis of season 1, but seeing him appear again in season 2 reminded me of all the development he has received. He started out as basically one of the many stooges to Skaar Lamine, but after being disrespected and banished by Mrs. Sartori and then being saved and shown genuine compassion by Kipo, he begins to realize that he may be fighting for the wrong side. This accumulates towards the end of season 1, wherein he saves the main group from being captured by the other mutes working for Skaar Lamine and sets them free. However, Jamak does not have an instant transformation. He is still confused as to what is right and wrong, and whether he should live his life selfishly the way he was taught, or by helping people the way Kipo has done to him. In season 2, we see that he is still on the path of self-discovery, seemingly just doing his best to survive day-to-day life on the surface. For someone like me, who wasn't really considering Jamak as a major player in this story, it might come as a surprise to see him reappear in the show like we see in season 2, and for him to feel like one of the most genuinely compelling characters in the show despite his relatively low amount of screen time. But I figured it out. I now understand why I love Jamak so much and why I'm confident that he will go on to be potentially the single best character in this entire show. Have I built enough suspense yet? Are you ready to find out? Okay, here we go. Jamak is literally Zuko. Think about it, literally every character beat from Jamak has a nearly one-to-one parallel in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He begins the show hunting down the main character. He is banished from the society in which he grew up and is given a visual signifier of his banishment and shame. He wanders the earth alone doing some soul searching. In the process of this, he does a good deed by freeing one or more of the main group members from captivity. And following this, he remains confused over what is right and wrong. Okay, obviously Jamak's story is not complete yet, but even from what we've seen so far, the parallels to Zuko's arc are so undeniably strong that I find it almost impossible to believe that the creators of Kipo aren't aware of this. Now, I should make it clear that although I am drawing comparison between Jamak and Zuko, I am not stating that they have been executed with comparable levels of quality. I mean, let's be honest, Zuko is just clearly on another level of character writing. His mental state was more thoroughly explored, his actions tied into the main plot and themes of the show better, and he was simply given more screen time. But even a watered down version of Zuko is still good enough to potentially be the best character in Kipo, and so I'm excited to see the rest of Jamak's arc play out. But anyway, moving on to the real meat of this section and what I believe to be far and away the best element of Season 2, we have Skaar Lamine. I was initially pretty neutral about Skaar Lamine as a villain. I figured that it would be the simple, humans have imprisoned animals for thousands of years and now we want revenge type of conflict, which would have been fine. But they really went above and beyond my expectations with this character, and it all has to do with his motivations. I think that we can all agree that in general, a character being evil just for the sake of being evil is pretty uncompelling. Of course, this isn't to say that all villains who fit this category are bad though, but a conflict in your story will usually be more engaging if the audience can sympathize with both of the conflicting parties. And Kipo in the Age of Wonderbeasts absolutely nails this with Skaar Lamine. Episode 8, Sympathy for the Mandrill, is almost entirely focused on Skaar Lamine's backstory. We learn that many years ago, Kipo's parents were a part of a team of scientists who were devoted to figuring out why animals had been mutating and how to develop a way to turn them back to their unintelligent forms the way they were before the apocalypse. And to do this, they needed to figure out what was making the animals mutate in the first place. Enter Hugo. Hugo was a regular Mandrill, one without the mutagen, and Kipo's parents were tasked with giving him a series of formulas in order to synthesize the mutagen, and they succeeded. Not only did Hugo gain human intelligence, but the mutagen amplified the effects of his pheromones, giving him control over any primate that he manages to get them on. The other scientists see this as an incredible breakthrough and opportunity, and they quickly have Hugo running on a treadmill day in and day out so that he'll produce more pheromones. But Kipo's parents disagree with continuing to experiment on Hugo. They have become attached to him, and they plan to escape the lab complex with Hugo. But unfortunately, before they get the chance, the building is suddenly destroyed by what the audience knows is Kipo's mom turning into the Mega Monkey. And following this, Hugo is stranded on the surface, alone and scared, until he runs into Leo, Kipo's father, and learns that he never came back to the rubble to look for Hugo because he prioritized the life of his child above everything else, including Hugo. In an instant, Hugo sees all the love that Leo had shown him as being ripped away. He thinks that the one remaining source of emotional connection he has left in the world was a lie all along, and that Leo never truly cared about him. And this hurts worse than any of the fear he felt for his life since the lab was destroyed. As a result, Hugo decides that rather than asking others for a better life, he would take it by force under the new name of Skaar Lamine. The fact that episode 8 is called Sympathy for the Mandrill is incredibly fitting. Skaar Lamine had a terrible childhood, and despite that, he was still an incredibly kind and understanding person. Even his desire to be a king was fueled by wanting to create a better life for himself along with the people he loved. And even still, his transformation into a very different person, the character we see in the present, is completely understandable. I mean, listen to this clip and just try to tell me that Skaar Lamine's actions are completely unreasonable.
No one ever chooses me. Unless I make them.
All Skaar Lamine wanted was to be accepted, to be cared about, to be loved, and from his perspective, it was made clear time and time again that no one cares. And since no one cares about him, why should he care about anyone else? After all, it is a mute-eat-mute world. Skaar Lamine's backstory and transformation are handled so well that in just one episode, it managed to make him a strong contender for my favorite character in the entire show. And on top of this, I absolutely love how Hugo's change is framed as an unfortunate result of circumstance because Leo never meant to leave him behind. And the fact that he prioritized his own infant daughter's life above Hugo's is completely understandable, but that doesn't make it hurt any less for Hugo. This actually gets into the one small gripe I have with Skaar Lamine's backstory, and it is that Leo is framed as having made a mistake by not going back to the rubble to see if Hugo was okay. But I honestly think that Leo was actually completely justified in his actions, because again, he was protecting the life of his daughter, and if what he said was true, he was on the run from mutes ever since the lab was destroyed. And the fact that everyone just seems to accept that Leo should have gone back for Hugo despite all of this was a little annoying, but honestly, this really is a minor issue I have with this otherwise amazing development of the story. I'd also like to mention that I love that Skaar Lamine isn't just pardoned for all of his immoral actions at the end of the season. In fact, he seemingly is going to be put in jail for them. It demonstrates that although Skaar Lamine is deserving of sympathy and his actions are forgivable, and trust me, he will get a redemption arc later on, that does not mean that he shouldn't face the consequences of those actions. Getting back to Skaar Lamine's backstory, another reason I love it so much is because it connects the main conflict of the narrative with the world building of the show. For one, it calls more attention to the apocalypse which occurred 200 years ago. If you watched my video about season 1, you'll recall that I mentioned that I was expecting this show to focus on its character arcs above all else, and this would include establishing any information about the world. And although I was sad that this was the case, I was still fine because I liked the characters and their stories regardless of how much I knew about the setting. But now we have world building and character development all wrapped up into one info dump. The whole reason Hugo is being experimented on is because the scientist group is trying to return the world to the way it once was and believes that turning the mutes back into their original animal form is the best way to go about doing this. This piece of information suggests that perhaps the mutes were not a result of the apocalypse, but rather the cause of it. I, for one, assumed that there was some sort of natural disaster that forced the humans underground, and with them gone, the animals re-established control over the surface and mutated possibly because of the natural disaster. And to have my assumption about the premise of this show challenged by the narrative was an incredibly good way to keep me engaged, because this is the kind of information I wanted all along but thought that we would never get. Furthermore, on the topic of world building and finishing off this section about antagonists, we have the scientists, more specifically Emilia. The group of scientists was a separate community from the borough that Kipo grew up in, and they even had some pretty advanced technology which introduces a whole new layer to action sequences now. But more importantly, it opens the door up to the existence of other humans in this series, outside of the random borough folk we already knew lived in the Clover Borough, and it opens up the door to the possibility of having human antagonists. The entirety of the series has framed humans as victims of the circumstances of the world and many of the mute species, so finding out that these people were literally planning on killing the main character after using her to kill the antagonist, who we now sympathize for, was an incredibly engaging development. And just like Skaar Lamine, their actions are completely understandable, even if they are portrayed in the least sympathetic manner of all the antagonists up to this point. Human society is a shadow of what it once was, and the implication is now that this is because dangerous mutated animals forced the humans underground. And even if some of them do have human-like intelligence, it's still reasonable to prioritize one's own species above others if it's for the sake of survival. Imagine if Earth got invaded by aliens that were just as advanced a species as us. We probably wouldn't hesitate to fight them for our own survival, even if they didn't necessarily deserve to be killed off. And this even funnels back into one of the main reasons I love Skaar Lamine and this development in the plot. No one in this show is framed as just being evil. Everyone has reasonable motivations and intentions that just happen to be in conflict with one another. This kind of writing takes so much thought and care put into it, and it results in a narrative that is entertaining from every angle you look at it. And furthermore, I'm very happy with the message that this show is obviously shooting for with this conflict, being the whole coexistence between humans and whatever else kind of theme. I mean, the simple fact that Kipo is half mute and the fact that she gets along with both mutes and humans makes this clear enough, but I would like to add that they took this element which only needed to support the theme and used it to simultaneously create more interpersonal drama. Because Kipo and Skaar Lamine are kinda like siblings. Both were raised by Kipo and Song, and both were an experiment involved in figuring out the mutagen that made animals the way they are now. By the way, seeing Kipo use her jaguar arm as a baby kinda deflates the scene at the end of season 1 when she discovers it for the first time. However, when push comes to shove, it was made clear that Song and Leo cared more about Kipo than Hugo, which is what led to Hugo becoming Skaar Lamine. What this means is that Kipo is a constant reminder of the pain that Skaar Lamine felt, and there is nothing that either of them can really do about it. That's some pretty fucking powerful emotional tension right there. This is unrelated, but I also felt like this show got noticeably funnier this season. I mean, don't get me wrong, season 1 wasn't unfunny, but I really can't remember any laugh out loud jokes except Dave saying that the earth was flat. But this time around, I was laughing once every few episodes and cracking a smile for much more of it. I know that this show doesn't really need comedy to continue being enjoyable, but I felt it was worth mentioning. So with that said, what do I think about season 2 of Kipo and the Age of Wonderbeasts on the whole in comparison to season 1? Well, you'll remember that I had quite a lot of positives to say about season 1, but just felt like it wasn't quite living up to the potential that I knew it could. I wanted more expansion on pretty much every element, and we definitely got that for some stuff in season 2. On top of that, I felt like this season was a little more focused than season 1. There were a lot of choices that had to be made to establish characters and set pieces early on in the story that would be important later, so it sometimes became hard to know in the moment why we should be invested in whatever's going on screen. But season 2 didn't have to spend any time creating the building blocks that season 1 did, and as a result, it felt like more important stuff happened this time around, which kept me consistently interested. It did, however, have its low points, which were not the greatest to get through, but I think that overall, season 2 was better than season 1. So the question of this video must be asked, is season 2 a masterpiece? Well, I think it's probably obvious what I think based on the contents of this video, but I would have to say no. Season 2 was definitely an improvement in my opinion, but this show still has a long way to go if it wants to be considered a true masterpiece. This show doesn't really have any huge fundamental flaws, and it does a lot of stuff well, but the stuff it does well, it usually only does pretty well, and this was the entire thesis statement of my video about season 1. Like, remember how I was talking about Jamak being a watered down version of Zuko and how that still meant that he was pretty good? Well, if he were a masterpiece, he wouldn't be watered down at all, you know? Despite this, I still feel like season 2 was an overall level up from season 1, and even if I can't say that Kipo and the Age of Wonderbeasts is a masterpiece, I am still confident saying that this is a solid piece of entertainment, especially after watching its second season. Obviously, I can still see this show becoming an amazing experience as it continues, especially if it keeps improving the way it has, and I am incredibly excited to see where it might go in the future. But of course, only time will reveal what this show has in store for us. With all that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching this video. I plan to continue talking about Kipo and the Age of Wonderbeasts in the future as it continues to come out, and so long as I continue to have interesting things to say about it. But what did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts about the second season of this show down in the comments, along with anything you might want to add to what I've said about it in this video. If you enjoyed this style of video, you'll find many others like it on my channel, so check it out if that interests you. And of course, if you want to keep up to date with my content as it comes out, I'd implore you to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified of when I upload in the future. I hope you have a wonderful day, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.